Hi everyone, Eric here. We produce a daily newsletter that if you're a professional who follows African affairs or Chinese foreign policy, you're definitely going to want to consider subscribing to. It's packed chock full of primary source information, the latest news and research, data, and of course our own exclusive analysis. To find out more, go to chinaafricaproject.com/subscribe. We'll give it to you free for the first 2 weeks just to see if you like it. You can cancel at any time if you're not happy. Also, if you use the promo code PODCAST at checkout, we'll throw in a really big, juicy discount. Of course, it's always half off for students and teachers. Once again, that's chinaafricaproject.com/subscribe.
The China and Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on Africa-China relations through innovative training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.co.za.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Network from SupChina. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by Cobus van Staden, the senior China-Africa researcher at the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. A very good morning to you, Cobus.
Good morning.
Cobus, for regular listeners of our program will know that we have been talking about energy issues quite a bit over the past couple of months, looking at the Suapiti hydroelectric dam in Guinea, also the Sengwa coal-fired power plant in Zimbabwe, both projects financed and constructed by the Chinese government. Sengwa, of course, still yet to be constructed and in development, but backed by the Chinese. And it really brings us to the issue of electricity and power generation in Africa as one of the most important issues in the development space, but also because when there is a recovery coming out of COVID-19, power is going to be critical, in part because currently, right now, 650 million Africans, which is about 2/3 of the entire continent's population, still lack access to reliable electricity. We're also looking at an energy infrastructure deficit that is shaving off percentage points from GDP, so holding back the productivity. The African Development Bank estimates that every year somewhere between 2 and 4% of African GDP is cut down because of a lack of consistent, reliable power generation. So it is going to be a very, very critical issue. But as we've talked about on this program for months and years now, the Chinese have played a very, very important role in financing a lot of the new energy capacity, whether it's solar power plants in Zambia or, as we talked about, in Guinea and Zimbabwe. The Chinese have played a very important role. However, the COVID-19 crisis and the economic crisis seems to be having a dramatic impact on Chinese overseas energy financing. So China's two largest policy banks, both with global operations, we've talked about these a lot, the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China, have cut back their financing of energy projects to their lowest level since 2008, according to data from the Boston University Global Development Policy Center. So get this, China's policy banks issued only 3 loans for energy projects in 2019, totaling just $3.2 billion, which is down a whopping 71% from the $11 billion that they did in 2018. So Cobus, that is ominous, I think, for Africa, where there is such a power deficit and where reliance on Chinese infrastructure lending has been so critical, but going forward, it may not actually be possible.
Yes, it's worrying, and I think it's particularly worrying because it affects so many aspects of African futures at once. You know, as you say, it affects GDP. It tends to really dampen foreign direct investment if a country doesn't have a stable electricity supply. And of course, it also affects the future of all of these young people in Africa, particularly also environmentally, because you know, kind of as we've discussed before, coal-fired plants are surprisingly prominent still in the projects that are going ahead, but not having electricity has its own environmental impact. You know, so because then people are forced to burn wood, for example, to cook and you know, so that itself has a massive ecological footprint and then also a massive public health footprint.
So what we want to do today is, rather than focus on a specific country or a specific project, and even necessarily focusing on the Chinese uniquely. We want to step back and look at the energy market as a whole to get an overview of where the opportunities are, at the same time what the challenges are. And somebody who I've been following on LinkedIn for quite some time and who's also a close follower of the work we do is Thapelo Mokhathi, who is the executive director at Shumba Energy. Shumba Energy, for those who are not familiar, it's an energy company based in Botswana that has interests throughout the Southern African development community in coal, in solar, in all sorts of different ways. Thapelo, thank you so much for taking the time to join us from Johannesburg today. Very good morning to you.
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Cobus, for this opportunity.
Well, I'm looking at the Shumba Energy website, and on your site, you have a map of the SADC where you talk about the power deficits. In Botswana, there's a power deficit of 600 megawatts. In Zambia, 1,500. Zimbabwe, 950. South Africa, 21,000. And Namibia, 600 megawatts. So the demand for power is clear. The supply is not there. Why don't you kind of tell us where we are right now in terms of energy generation, energy distribution, especially in light of the economic crisis that we're facing today?
Okay, Eric. That fact sheet probably is about 4 years old now, but really not much has changed since then. The energy deficit in the southern region of the continent, it is still very, very dire. And just to give a context, the Southern African region really relies on Eskom. And as Cobus will know, Eskom has been having its own challenges, generation challenges. And countries like Namibia, countries like Botswana, countries like Zimbabwe, Lesotho have been reliant on Eskom for a long time. So, now with Eskom challenges, many of those countries have been exposed, and there's been a very serious movement for those countries to start looking at their own energy sustainability. So fortunately, in the Southern African region, I think also in Western East Africa, you have, what they call the interconnectors or the power pools, whereby, the energy that is produced in South Africa can be easily moved to Tanzania, can be moved all over the region, I guess with the exception of Malawi, Angola, where they are still busy with transmission investments. So the situation has not changed. What we have seen is that most of the new generation projects have been happening in South Africa, with obviously lots of constraints and a lot of challenges. As you know, Medupi and Kusile, which have been touted as the backbone of what Eskom power generation will be, have been having serious technical difficulties. But on the other side, South Africa has been very proactive, at least in the beginning, with the renewable energy projects. Anytime between 2013 to 2017, we saw investments of about 200 billion rand, I think, which is about $15 billion now, for the procurement of about 3,000 megawatts of electricity. And the project was stopped a bit, during late 2017, but we have seen now the resurgence again from the government pushing for the renewable energy procurement process. Now we see there is on the table demand for about 2,400 megawatts worth of projects that private companies needs to procure, or at least needs to produce on behalf of South Africa. But also we are seeing other procurement processes in Botswana. There's a 100 megawatt procurement process that is going there. Also in Zimbabwe, there is a RFI, or the request for information, for about 550 megawatts. So there is a whole lot of these projects that are happening. And I think for me, what is of interest, since you spoke about China earlier on, is that when this procurement process are out, that's really where you see the interest in financing for some of these projects. Most of these projects are oversubscribed, whereby all the developers from China, from Europe, from America wants to take part in these projects. So we'll really see what is happening, but there is greater need for energy generation now, especially if we are going to recover from this COVID crisis. And probably just to add, I mean, today is the 23rd of June. There is currently a symposium on infrastructure in South Africa, and I read some notes around that energy is going to be one of the big expenditure that the country will be undertaking. Also received a draft document from Botswana. Also the same thing. Energy is going to be the big project that the government is looking at. So we'll see exactly who are the people who will be interested in that, who will be participating. And for me, that would allow us to gauge exactly whether the Chinese, whether the Western countries are interested in investing in energy projects in the continent.
So, if we can unpack that point a little bit more, we tend to talk and we tend to focus a lot on Chinese involvement in some of these projects. But who are the other partners? You mentioned Western countries, but like which specific entities, are those governments or other kind of entities who tends to be funding these kind of electricity projects?
Just to give, what is a broader play here, Cobus, is that in Western countries, you find that it's private companies. But it's private companies that come with lots of concessional type of funding from their own government, because they want to finance infrastructure, the greening of the economy in the continent. So it will be led mainly by your private sector, but with big concessional funding from their own government. So while China will be a state-led companies, with obviously the state-backed finances.
There seems to be a real tension in Africa, as there is in other places, in terms of whether to use carbon-based energy or renewable energy. And in China, for example, where there's a schizophrenic view on these things, on the one hand, it's a hyper-green economy where solar's coming on, electric scooters, electric transportation's everywhere. It's a very modern society in that sense. But at the same time, Greenpeace reports this year that China's moving ahead with 48 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants, which is about 1.6 times the entire installed capacity of 2019. And that's on top of the 46 gigawatts that were already planned. Donald Trump in the United States is a huge advocate of coal. And we've talked about the Sengwa power plant in Zimbabwe, where a lot of people say coal actually does make sense given the fact that Southern Africa has an abundant supply of coal. At Shumba Energy, you are invested in coal and as well. Talk to us a little bit about the tension between renewable versus carbon-based energy.
The tension is real, Eric. And I think for the right reasons. I think any energy developer in Africa or anywhere in the world will be delusional not to think that we need to have far better energy efficiency across the world and across the region. But the tension really arises from the fact that when you're in the continent, when you're sitting in Zambia, when you're sitting in Zimbabwe, you don't have power. So the electorate, or at least the citizens, are a bit agnostic about where will that power come from. So whether the government pushes for renewable, whether it pushes for coal, people want power. And that's really, for me, where I normally see the tension rise. So until, at least from my side, until Africa is energy sustainable, those tensions are going to continue between people who says, it's all good to tell me about all these things that are important, but as things stands now, my situation is dire. And if you don't help me develop, if you don't help me, by providing the solution, I'm indifferent to what you are saying to me. But I think from government policy point of view, I mean, the issue of greening the economy is very important. But us as developers, therefore, being agnostic about the energy source, the question is exactly what each country will tolerate, and if all goes well and can be able to raise funding for this thing, it is something that will pursue. You're talking about China developing new coal plants. I mean, 2 weeks ago, I think I read a report that Germany opened about 1,100 megawatts coal-based power station. And I think last year or early January, Japan was putting about 22 power stations, coal-based power stations.
That's right. Japan is actually one of the fastest growing coal countries in the world. They got rid of their nuclear. So do you find there's a hypocrisy a little bit from countries like Japan, Europe, and the United States who are preaching to Africa to use renewable energy when in fact they themselves are still reliant on coal for a significant portion of their energy mix?
I won't really regard it as hypocrisy in that sense. Like I say, I think we acknowledge here, I think everybody acknowledges in the world, unless you're really stubborn, that we need to green our economies. I think for us, what we find is that the local realities are never considered whenever all these arguments are made. So the hypocrisy is not on the coal itself, but the hypocrisy is on, we understand, we agree, but you're leaving us on the ledge in terms of what needs to happen. So, at some point you need to come to a point where we all agree what is wrong, what is right, and if we agree this is what is right, what's going to be all of us all countries need to be focused on that what is right, which is the greening of the economy.
Well, in relation to that, if we take it out of the moral discussion for a moment about kind of future generations and the environment, if we just simply look at cost, how does coal and green energy break down in southern Africa in relation to cost? Because globally we've seen renewables, the prices really falling, and to the extent that in some countries they're now considered the more cost-effective option compared to coal. How does that shake out in southern Africa?
I think this is one of the contentious argument about the cost of energy. And I think us as players, as people who do these financial models all the time, the picture is how do I put it? It's much more complicated. If you are asking what is the cost of generation? Cost of generation is cheaper in solar. But what is the cost of operation? Just to really make an illustration, you're not really being in favor of coal or being in favor of solar, because I don't really wanna enter into that debate. But the reason, for example, Germany, and I'll use Germany and Japan, are pursuing these things because they tell you that the energy factor that they get from base load are much higher than the energy factor that they get from solar. As we know that base load will get you 24 hours, while renewable energy, depending on what type of renewable energy, will only get you certain amount of electricity per day. So if you're looking at one cost, which is generation cost, it is clear that renewable energies are cheap. But if you look at the entirety of the operation, then it's a debate of exactly what is cost effective. But obviously I'm excluding the environmental impact and all those sort of things. So I'm just now talking the cost from a face value point of view.
Yeah, that's the problem actually that they're having in countries like Vietnam and in Southeast Asia, where they're generating a lot of solar power. In fact, they are way ahead of schedule in terms of the amount of generation. It's the distribution, storage, and the processing of all that electricity that's causing problems. The grid simply can't keep up with the amount of electricity that's being generated. And I think that's a key problem in parts of Africa as well, where there's a disconnect between the generation and the distribution. Is that correct?
Absolutely. I mean, in South Africa now, I think Eskom CEO mentioned that to be able to absorb all the renewable energy, Eskom has to come with 20 billion rand, which is $750 million, I think, just on being able to accommodate the renewable energy on the grid. But the question is, who's going to absorb the cost? Because on the cost of generation of a solar plant, those costs are not reflected. But then Eskom has to put up $20 billion to be able to make sure that the grid is able to handle all the power from different sources with different energy levels.
Support for this podcast comes from the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University School of Journalism in Johannesburg. The ACRP provides reporting grants, workshops, and other professional development opportunities for both African and Chinese journalists. Follow the ACRP on Twitter at Wits China Africa or visit africachinareporting.co.za for information about grants and upcoming seminars.
In relation to the grid, to which extent are Southern African countries focused on creating and here I'm speaking from very low level of knowledge, so excuse any kind of mistakes, but to which extent are they focusing on creating what to my mind is a kind of a conventional centralized grid, and to which extent is microgrids part of the conversation?
From a regional point of view, as I mentioned earlier, you have a South African power pool, which is really a grid connection across all the countries. And that grid connection is being expanded now into Malawi, into Angola, into the DRC. So you have massive grid connection that can be able to evacuate power from wherever you're generating it in the region. Microgrids have really gained in prominence, especially in the continent. If you look at how sparse some of the areas around here are. So you look at countries like Namibia, Botswana, they're very sparsely populated. So it doesn't really make sense to put a huge 700 kV transmission line when you can, for a small community. And that's really where the microgrids are gaining prominence. So if you look at what is happening in the market now, those countries are issuing tenders for the microgrid. So they're gaining prominence just on the basis that they cater for regions that otherwise won't be catered for by huge investment in transmission lines.
Thapelo, help me understand something here, because this is part of the struggle that I've been trying to understand about where we go from here. So we're in the midst of now an unprecedented economic public health crisis that is changing absolutely everything, including trade. And one of the discussions that a lot of people are having in many parts of Africa and in many parts of the world is that we can no longer be so dependent on China for imports and for lots of the things that we consume. So therefore, they want to increase manufacturing in parts of Africa so that they can kind of end some of the dependency. This is not like the decoupling that we're hearing from the United States, but it's this idea of it's not safe economically to be so dependent on China. But the problem is in Africa, is in order to build a manufacturing center, you have to have an energy capacity. You have to be able to have factories that run reliably, and that is a big problem. And so we hear all of this happy talk about growing the manufacturing center. And I say happy talk because I feel like sometimes it's disconnected from the power supply question that you focus on every day. What is the feasibility of building legitimate manufacturing in many parts of Africa and at the same time building up that power generation capacity and closing the power generation deficit? How do you think about that from the power side of things?
Eric, for us, talking as Shumba Energy, as developers, we think that the whole reindustrialization of our region is very important. And, initially what will happen, we always had a chicken and egg situation whereby we're going to produce power, excess power, who's going to consume that power? So I think what is going to be interesting is that if there is serious aggregate demand, let's say for industrialization, then it justifies the investment in power. And the question will be, how methodical are we as a continent, as countries, to be able to align the two things, to say, my power availability will meet my manufacturing needs capacity. So what will really be required from the African continent, as they are calling for this, is to be able to calibrate this thing very well, or else it's just going to be one of those wishes that we make in the continent that we never realize. But I think the call for manufacturing, again, the call for being self-sustainable in critical products in the country, will really should make our policy makers here think about this broadly, to say you can't have manufacturing capacity without electricity, and you can't have excess electricity without the consumer. But if they implement this thing clearly and well thought, then I think there's a saying in this continent that you hit two birds with one stone. So we have that opportunity to be able to hit both increased capacity of our manufacturing and the power generation side of our economies.
This week, as we're recording, there's a kind of Pan-African virtual summit happening in relation to the Grand Inga Dam in the Congo, or the Grand Inga 3 Dam in the Congo. This is one of those projects in Africa that people always discuss and it's going to be a game changer, and then it somehow so far hasn't been realized. How optimistic are you about this project, and in general, what do you think of its future role?
If we're really serious about the greening of economy in the continent, I think Grand Inga Dam is going to play a very critical role. What is really what's going to be, personally, I'm sort of 50-50. It can happen. The justification for it to happen are there, but whether there's a political will, to make it happen is something that I really doubt. Just to give a sort of a perspective, in South African IRP, so Integrated Resource Plan, they put about 2,500 megawatts of hydropower needs to come from the Congo. But to be able to evacuate that power from the Congo, you need to build a transmission line that goes obviously Congo, Zambia, or Angola, into Botswana, or depending what route they choose, into South Africa. And the history tells me that it is very difficult to do cross-border projects in the continent. Putting that transmission line will take long. So I'm really 50-50 to it. I think it's a project with a potential, but if countries that are closer to the project are not going to be working together, that project is not going to happen, no matter how good the project will be for the continent.
So you think when we look at these different ideas and these projects about power generation, that the national projects have a better chance of succeeding rather than anything cross-border or Pan-African?
Absolutely. I mean, the very few Pan-African projects or inter-country projects that happen here.
Okay, so let's kind of, again, look forward and taking into account the moment that we're in today. Right now, Kenya's credit rating is under review from Moody's. South Africa has been downgraded by S&P and Moody's. Ethiopia has been downgraded as well. We're looking at a financial crisis of enormous magnitude here. And the ability for African countries to go out into the capital markets to borrow is going to be more difficult, given the fact that they are now running massive deficits. They're asking for delays and suspensions on debt repayments. They probably are going to find it difficult to borrow more. The Chinese, as we've talked about at the beginning of the show, don't seem to be as eager to bring out the big giant checkbooks anymore like they were in the past. So where does the money come from? You mentioned, early on in our discussion that still power projects are oversubscribed. And I'm curious about, is that going to fulfill the financing gap that will build this infrastructure to produce power?
Africa infrastructure needs are obviously huge, But normally what I find is that in energy projects, there's always financial structures that allow even countries that are in no position to raise capital to finance, to be able to finance those projects. And I'll just make a few examples. In countries like Zimbabwe, where you have big platinum players, depending on how government arranges the procurement process, you have ability for private companies to be able to stand guarantee for the power project. They'll be the off-takers of the project, but also they'll enable government to be able to get the project going. In South Africa now, I think in March, the government said to companies they can self-generate, their own power. So many of the companies are blue chip. They have a strong balance sheet, so they have the ability to be able to procure the energy. So as I said earlier on, also with the some of the European countries with the concessional loans where they have grants and all those sort of things. So it's not gonna be straightforward as you're saying that I'm gonna move from here to the capital markets and raise money. It's really gonna depend on how you structure it. Who's gonna be the off taker behind? Who's gonna be the end user? And those things, obviously, I don't know what capacity of that is available or eligible in the continent, but you're still going to see a lot of players still taking chances to develop power projects in these countries, despite the challenges that you alluded to.
Which countries in Africa are you most optimistic about in terms of their kind of short to medium term electricity supplies, and which are you most worried about?
Interesting question. It's a tough one, Cobus. I mean, now if you look at it, I'll say Namibia should be leading in terms of renewable projects after South Africa. Botswana too. Countries with good credit rating, they are solid. These countries, for me, should be leading, but their power consumption is still very low. You can't put 2,000 megawatts there. There'll really be no need for it. But you also find that there's interest in Zim, especially on the energy side. Countries that will really be worried about, and I hope this does not jeopardize my future business transaction, are really countries like your Zambia, countries like Malawi. There's just too many uncertainties from regulatory, from just a lot of things that are happening. Obviously, Zambia, as compared to other SADC countries, has serious debt, currency problems. So I see those two countries as, I may add Angola to it, but for me, those three countries, it will be to take a long assessment, obviously depending on what transaction is available there, but it is watch and wait with those countries. While countries like Namibia, Botswana, even South Africa, depending obviously on these things are structured, they'll really present good opportunities for developers of energy in the continent.
And very quickly before we go, because we want to let you get back to your day, going forward, just picking up on Cobus's question there, looking at where you think there's opportunities and where you don't, renewable versus coal, where do you think the direction is going?
I think we're seeing the end of coal, in a substantive level. So we're going to see more gas, we're going to see more renewables, but coal, really, because then it's a function of funding. Many of the trusted funding partners, China, Japan, Korea, are very reluctant to fund now. South African banks have made it clear that they don't want to fund coal-based power station. So it's renewable. In the long term, it's going to be renewable, but we're still going to need to see a lot of base load. I mean, South Africa last week they issued a request for information for nuclear. So, but coal is really, it has reached its limit. I think we're going to see the current power station operating probably for the next 30 years or so. But post that, I don't see them new power stations being erected, at least this part of the world.
Okay, well, that's encouraging, at least in one sense, from an environmental point of view. Thapelo Mokhathi is the executive director at Shumba Energy. He's based in Johannesburg. Shumba Energy is out of Botswana. Thapelo, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We really appreciate it. And also, a big thank you for being a subscriber to our daily newsletter. So we're glad that you are following us and hope that you're enjoying the newsletter as well.
No, to Cobus and Eric, thanks for the opportunity, guys, and keep up the good work.
Cobus, throughout the discussion with Thapelo, I kept thinking about the pragmatism that he's bringing to it. And he said something very interesting. He said, people just don't care where it comes from. And I think that pragmatism aligns with the Chinese approach on these things. And the Chinese don't seem to be dogmatic or ideological about renewable versus coal versus hydro. It's what the host country wants. At the same time, I think the Chinese they like hydro and they like coal and these things, so they can actually build that very efficiently. But if a country says we want to do solar, as the case is in a $500 million solar power plant in Zambia that the Chinese are involved in, they'll do that. So this pragmatism, I think, is very, very important. And that was one of the themes that came out of the conversation with Thapelo, very, very clear.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a complicated question for me because what strikes me is that this kind of pragmatism, I'm not mentioning discussing Thapelo particularly, but as you mentioned, the Chinese pragmatism or the kind of agnosticism about whether to build one or the other, that kind of decision making reflects a certain kind of way that certain costs are not factored into the calculations. So the long-term cost of carbon, air pollution is not factored in, and obviously there's been a lot of work to try and start to put a price on carbon pollution. But the long-term effects of coal mining is also not factored in there. Kind of that is usually externalized to the state, actually, or to local communities. And one thing, South Africa is a big coal mining area, and coal mining is extremely destructive. Like it's frequently open pit mining. And then South Africa has developed a massive problem with water, groundwater coming up through those mines and then kind of streaming out. And that water is extremely acidic because it's been moving across coal faces for so much. So sometimes that water is on the same pH as lemon juice, very, very acidic and very environmentally destructive. But the bill for that coal mining isn't factored into these discussions. That bill goes to local communities or to the state. So so for me, that pragmatism has some weaknesses in terms of in terms of the kind of realistic way that it looks at the long-term impact of these projects.
As we think about the power mix between coal, renewable, carbon-based energy, I think we should focus a lot on what's going on in Kenya. Now, Kenya is a particular example, but in many ways, I think it highlights where everybody wants to go and should go, in part because it is mostly renewable. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's close to 90+% renewable, and President Uhuru Kenyatta's goal is to get it to 100% renewable. And the Chinese are involved in that. So again, it's one of these things where people will say the Chinese are supporting coal or supporting hydro, which are, again, very environmentally heavy and impact. But at the same time, they are also active in the solar market. Last year, the Chinese opened and built a 50 megawatt solar power plant in Garissa, which is in northern Kenya. And for the first time, that part of Kenya now is part of the national grid because of this Chinese built 50 megawatt plant. So again, it's one of these stories, Cobus, where a lot of people will assign the Chinese to be a positive player or a negative player, but it's actually both and.
Yes, and the role of these governments, China in particular, I think really needs a lot more scrutiny. Another one that really baffles me is Japan. Like as you mentioned, Japan, is phasing out nuclear energy after the Fukushima disaster, among others because that it makes a lot of political sense within Japan. And in response, they're putting in a lot of coal, but I have never understood why Japan didn't follow Kenya's route and Iceland's route, both of which managed to get very clean energy through the use of geothermal. And if you go around in rural Japan, there's parts of rural Japan where you literally have like bubbling geysers and bubbling kind of like pools of boiling mud. This, kind of the fault lines are so close to the surface. I never understood why Japan isn't a world leader in geothermal energy, and why, kind of why a country like Japan, a country like Germany is still why they're still kind of factoring coal in at all. It's like I think the global north needs a much harder kind of look at the decisions they're making.
Well, we're glad to have had the opportunity to speak with Thapelo and to kind of, again, step back from the minutia of the China-Africa relationship, because we're going to dive deeper into China-Africa power issues over the next 6 months. But we thought it would be a good benchmark to have someone like Thapelo come on and kind of lay the groundwork for us about some of the challenges in terms of financing, distribution, generation, transmission, cross-border transmission, again, a problem. Cobus, that was one of the consistent things we've been hearing in a number of our discussions, is that we talked about it in our conversation about rice growing, that it's cheaper and easier to sell rice to China than it is for Mozambique to sell rice into Southern Africa. And this, again, I was thinking about the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, and that maybe, I don't know if power is part of that as well, but it really highlights the work that's ahead for Africa to be able to make it easier to do things cross-border. Do you know if power is impacted by AFCTA?
I don't know at all. It'll be very interesting to know.
Yeah, it's something that would actually be very useful. I mean, you in South Africa, and he mentioned this about Eskom has been supplying big chunks of Southern Africa with power. But again, the power distribution issue is going to be something very interesting to look at. So good for us to step back every once in a while and get an industry point of view from someone like Thapelo. We're very glad that he was able to join us. Thapelo is the kind of person who's also subscribing to our newsletter every day and reading the market intelligence that we're bringing in this daily digest that we do, where we summarize all the day's China-Africa news. We've got banks, diplomats, agencies, companies, all different players. Lots of academics are following it every day. We would love for you to join Thapelo and our reader community. Just go to ChinaAfricaProject.com/subscribe. If you use the promo code podcast, there'll be a nice chunky discount that we'll throw in for you at the end. And part of it is when you subscribe, you can talk to Cobus and I a lot. Just send us an email. We give lots of feedback and we engage with our readers almost every day. So we would love to hear from you. Even if you're not a subscriber, but just a loyal listener, it's easy to find us. You can reach me at eric@ChinaAfricaProject.com or Cobus@ChinaAfricaProject.com. Both of us are also on Twitter. We'll have all of that information from the kind lady at the end of the show. So that'll do it for this edition of the China in Africa podcast. Cobus and I will be back again next week with another show. Until then, for Cobus Van Staden, I'm Eric Olander. Thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Head over to facebook.com/China Africa Project to share your thoughts on today's show. The guys are also on Twitter, where you can find Cobus @Stadinsky or Eric @E.Olander. And be sure to sign up for the weekly China in Africa email newsletter by going to www.ChinaAfricaProject.com.